let's talk about the regions of Scottish whiskey. We already did the types of Scottish whiskey, but now we're going to talk about regions. Regions, I did a whole thing about whiskey regions, you know, and are there whiskey regions in America? What is the value of whiskey regions? Where I concluded that it's mostly tourism. But the only place in the world that's really dominated the idea of whiskey regions is Scotland. They even have minimum requirements for how many distilleries need to exist in order for a region to be a region. So let's talk about the regions. First, we're going to talk about lowlands. Lowlands is the part of Scotland that borders England, and it goes all the way up to just around Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it's a sort of, Edinburgh and Glasgow are both considered lowlands. And anything south of that to England is lowlands. Now, historically, that was dominated by large producers and bulk and a lot of the blended, they didn't have to go as far to market and things like that. and the land was easier. You got farmland down there and things. And so the lowlands originally, there were only a handful you could get in the US, like Auchentoshan, which I love. But recently, we've seen a whole new growth in new distilleries in the lowlands, and that's been really exciting, including Loch Lea, which we've reviewed on this channel. The line that sort of officially designates the distinction between lowlands and highlands, called the Highland Line, is sort of arbitrarily run diagonal, not straight line, but it runs basically from the Clyde in the west, so my right, your left, and Tay on the other side. And that line roughly follows a geographic line of the Highlands. And everything north of that is Highlands. Everything north of that is Highlands. Except inside of the Highlands, there's a small little U-shaped sort of region up in like Aberdeenshire on the edge. Like if Scotland has this little ledge that comes down right here and it faces the North Sea and then it continues back down to Edinburgh over here. That little ledge and the land like right in that little hollow of that ledge is considered Speyside, S-P-E-Y-S-I-D-E. Speyside is Highlands the way that Texas is America. It depends on who you ask. Legally, a Speyside distillery like Macallan or, any other ones, Aberlour, they could officially label their whiskey as a Highland malt. And that's why you get Macallan's labeled as the famous Highland malt Macallan, when technically it's right in the middle of the Speyside region. Now, why would you do that? Asks a marketing guy. Because more people know what Highland is than Speyside. I can't count how many times I've been in tasting. I'd say, this is a Speyside Scotch. And they're like, Speyside? Like, no, not space. Spey, as in the River Spey. And it really does. It follows the River Spey. It's basically a ton of distilleries are sort of glutted around the River Spey and the areas around the River Spey. Why? Because access to water, access to farmland, access to the North Sea and coastal, and then when the trains came in, access to train routes. So there's a big density. Everything else is considered a Highlands. There is a group of people who sort of argue that the islands are their own separate region, and they would consider, Skye and Mull and maybe even the Orkney Islands to be like the island regions. But according to the official Scottish Whisky Association, that's all just the Highlands. Now, there's a fourth region called Campbelltown, and I'm going to go into that in a second. First, let's talk about Glenfiddich. Glenfiddich 12. I love Glenfiddich. I think their story of their brand is amazing. I think they are one of the great classic Scottish single malts. You can find them everywhere. They just about single-handedly initiated putting single malt back on the market in the modern era in the 60s when everybody else was going into blends and burying and closing distilleries. Glenfiddich was like, screw you guys, we're going all in on this single malt thing. And they put all this marketing money into it and they went down the premium single malt. They cracked into foreign and US markets. I mean, that's foreign for them too, but not for me. And they were one of the first people to do tubes. They were one of the first people to do duty-free whiskey releases, just across the board. William Grant and Sons as a company, I'm a big fan. I think they do a great job. And then following them, you had Diageo, or around that time, you had Diageo going into the classic malts of Scotland era, which they still do. And that's, releasing Lagavulin and Oban and so on. This is their classic 12. This is the one that sort of reintroduced single malt to the world. And it's, I think, very underrated by whiskey snobs, but well loved by people who work in the whiskey industry and who know Scotch. So when you get new people who are new to whiskey and they get really obsessed with Scotch, this is one of the first ones that they sort of leave behind because it's usually a gateway whiskey. But I think you always end up returning to the real classic things that you loved and that were easy and that you can appreciate. And I love Glenfiddich 12. I love that it's got that same sort of like light citrus touch to it. It's a little floral instead of fruity. Although there are fruit notes, it's got a little more earth to it and a little less honey cream than like a Glenmorangie 10. And it's got a little more weight to it. And even at a low proof, which this is 40, right on the nose, it's got a great nose. This is a mix of bourbon cask and sherry casks. Yeah, it's very soft, very like buttercream with a little bit of prickly pepper, a little hint of vanilla fruit and berries and cream, a little bit of earth. Yeah, it's just great Scotch. I'm gonna add a little water, and look, guys, look what I brought. Look, I got a water dropper thing. Bloop. I'm gonna do that. We're gonna see what happens. Anytime I'm somewhere and they don't have a great whiskey selection, but they will always have Jameson and Glenfiddich, I'm just like, oh, okay, I'm gonna be fine. Did you know that Glenfiddich, William Grant and Sons, had an artist in residence program that they started in 2002 that they're still doing, as far as I know? How cool is that? That they have an actual budget for artists to come live and do their art and work at Glenfiddich and they have a bunch of them at a time. Yeah. I might be overselling the William Grant and Sons thing, but I really admire them as a company. Kind of the same way I feel about Maker's Mark as a company and their early days of going on quality when everyone else is going for the lowest common denominator. That dash of water, it softens it even more, but it also allows a little bit of the earth to come to the front. And I like it without the water, but it's nice still. The nose sort of opens up a little bit and gets a little less fruity. It's a great whiskey. More floral, more floral and fauna, which is like a whole series of the flora and fauna. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so Campbelltown, the fourth region of Scotland. Campbelltown is, if you're looking at the map of Scotland, it comes off over here, sort of looks like the Baja Peninsula of Scotland. And it sort of curls down between the mainland of the island of Scotland and Islay over here. And in between it, on its other side, it's got Arran, Isle of Arran. And it's sort of the end of the Kintyre, the foot of the Kintyre range and West Argyll. And it sticks all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean, and at one time had a massive amount of distilleries comparatively for the head count because it's surrounded on three sides by water access. So it's great for boats and shipping, and it can get straight to England. It can get to Ireland. Now it has three, although there are 3 or 4 new distilleries in the works in Campbelltown, which is great news, I think, for anybody who loves Campbelltown Scotch. It's really not easy to get Campbelltown. The easiest ones we can get in Texas right now is Glen Scotia. Springbank is my favorite one. I like Glengyle, which you see released as Kilkerran, but I haven't seen them around as easily these days. And then you've got Islay. This is a little island off the west coast of Campbelltown. You take a ferry straight from Campbelltown over to it, and It has got a shocking density of distilleries for the size of the island and the amount of people on it. And it's all the most famous smoky scotches that you've heard of: Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Ardbeg, and then your lighter ones: Bruichladdich, Bunnahabhain, Caol Ila, the largest component in a lot of blends, and Killoman, and just the list goes on and on. It's so good. I love Islay. That's probably my home turf for my favorite whiskeys. And yeah, it does tend to be meatier, heftier, often smokier whiskey. Now, does a region mean taste? I would argue that only in Scotland do you get something that sort of gets as close as I think you're ever going to get to a sort of general directionality to a distillery. Now, as distilleries have grown in the last 30 years and they have started experimenting more and new distilleries have started new processes, that's becoming less and less true every year. I mean, Islay used to be famous for smoky whiskey, but now, Bruichladdich, the laddie, it's unpeated, and Bunnahabhain 12 is soft and gentle, and so that's not all Islay is smoke. But generally speaking, if you say Islay, you can sort of assume this directionality of hefty, weighty, and smoky. Generally speaking, the lowlands I've had tend to be a little more floral and earth and grass and green, and the highlands tend to be a little bit more weighty and a little more like forest earthy and sometimes briny as you get to the coast or in the direction of like saltwater, even though there's no saltwater. Just this sort of like sparkly, sharp, and some prickly, not quite dark smoke like Laphroaig, but like essence of prickly smoke. And then Speyside tends to be a little more butterscotch and a little more fruity and a little more light and pretty. Campbelltown tends to be generically a little more medicinal, a little more of the phenolic notes, a little more of that body. But again, in every one of those regions, I can give you a half dozen complete exceptions to the rule. So again, we come back to, do regions matter? For tourism, hell yeah. For sort of a general, like maybe you'll like this, in Scotland, maybe, but every year further we get, it's less and less true, which I think is a wonderful thing. One of my favorite smoky scotches that was a really unexpected find for me is a lowland whiskey, and right now, the name of the distillery, it starts with an A, and it's completely escaping me, and I can't believe it. Oh man, I'm actually gonna look it up. I'm gonna look it up, because if you don't know about it, you should. Lowland Scotch Distilleries, and I'm gonna kick myself for forgetting. It starts with an A, and it is Ailsa. Ha ha! Ailsa Bay. Ailsa. I think that's how you pronounce it. Ailsa Bay. I found that one in Scotland. Oh, I love it. So good. And it's smoky. Not like any of the other lowlands that I've tried, although I'm starting to see more of that. So good luck on your adventure. I hope that helps you understand the 5 legal regions. And, drinking more scotch is not a bad thing. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. If Scotland ever comes up with a different region, then you'll find out about it here. And so you should like and subscribe so you'll know when that happens.